What would you do if saving a child from danger meant putting everything you love at risk? Marcus never expected to become a hero, but when he stepped in to protect an innocent boy, he unknowingly entered a world where every choice could cost him everything. Now, with a dark warning hanging over him, his fight for the boy's safety is just beginning, and the real danger is only getting closer. It's a regular afternoon, the kind that should be filled with nothing but the innocence of childhood. Sunlight filtering through the trees, laughter echoing in the distance, and the soft sound of a swing creaking in the breeze. The kind of day where a parent's worries are pushed aside because their children are safe. Or at least, that's what Marcus thought as he made his way across the park. He had no reason to be suspicious, no reason to think that something dark and dangerous was unfolding just a few yards away. He was just a guy, going about his day, a jogger, a man with a coffee in hand, the world moving in slow motion around him, a sense of calm and familiarity in the air. He had no idea that in the very place he walked, where children ran and mothers chatted idly, danger was creeping in. That for some, peace was nothing but a fleeting illusion. That, for one boy, the serenity of the park was about to shatter. Marcus noticed him right away. The little boy, around 8 years old, with messy hair and a worn-out baseball cap. He was standing by the swings, looking down at the ground, kicking pebbles and picking them up again. He was alone. A few moments later, Marcus saw the man approach. At first, Marcus didn't think much of it. There were plenty of adults around the park, just like the guy who looked to be in his late 30s, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans. He didn't stand out. Nothing in his posture screamed danger. But there was something in the way he moved that caught Marcus's attention. Too quick, too deliberate. The way the man's eyes darted around as if he were calculating his next move. Something was off. Marcus slowed his pace. He didn't even consciously decide to. It just happened. There was an instinct that had kicked in, the kind of awareness that takes over when you sense something isn't right. His feet moved as if they were on autopilot, drawn toward the scene unfolding in front of him. The man reached the boy and stopped. He said something. Marcus couldn't hear it from where he stood, but the boy's shoulders hunched. The boy didn't look up. He just continued kicking the pebbles. Marcus's heart skipped. Something wasn't right. The stranger's hand reached out, fingers closing around the boy's arm. The child flinched, and Marcus saw it. The boy wasn't just scared. He was terrified. The kind of fear that comes when you know something terrible is about to happen. Marcus's muscles tensed, his body moving before his brain could catch up. There was no time to call for help, no time to assess the situation. Only the moment. The stranger's grip tightened. The boy's eyes went wide as he tried to pull away, but the man didn't loosen his hold. Instead, he yanked the child toward him, the boy stumbling in his wake, trying to break free. A sense of urgency flooded Marcus's chest. The boy was in trouble, real trouble. This wasn't some simple misunderstanding. Without thinking, Marcus was running. His legs pumped harder, faster. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as he closed the distance. He didn't look to see if anyone else noticed, didn't even think about what might happen next. It was like everything in the world slowed down, and all he could focus on was the boy, that child whose fear now burned in Marcus's gut. He reached them just in time. Marcus didn't hesitate. His hand shot out, shoving the man away with a force that surprised even him. The man stumbled back, momentarily disoriented, his grip loosening just enough for the boy to jerk his arm free. The boy darted away from him, eyes wide with panic. He didn't know where to go, but Marcus didn't care. He wasn't going to let this man get his hands on him again. "Run!" Marcus shouted, his voice loud enough to pierce the panic hanging in the air. The boy didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the nearest group of parents, his tiny legs carrying him faster than they should have been able to. The stranger, now recovering from the shock of Marcus's intervention, turned back toward the fleeing child, his face twisted with rage. He lunged forward, but Marcus was faster, placing himself squarely between the man and the boy, blocking him like a human wall. Marcus's eyes locked onto the man's, cold, dark eyes that flashed with a dangerous intent. The kind of eyes that didn't just want to hurt. They wanted to disappear. They wanted the boy to be lost. "You don't want to do this," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. He stood his ground, fists clenched at his sides, heart pounding. Every instinct screamed to take action, but Marcus knew one wrong move could escalate this situation into something far worse. The man sneered. He looked around, scanning the park as if weighing his options. And then, like a switch had been flipped, he turned and ran. No words, no threats, just the sound of his feet pounding the pavement as he disappeared into the shadows, blending into the park's edge as if he had never been there. Marcus stood there for a moment, breath coming in short bursts. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't over. Not yet. He turned toward the boy, who was now standing with a woman, his arms tightly wrapped around her. She was kneeling down, trying to comfort him, but the boy's eyes kept darting toward Marcus, a silent question in his gaze. Marcus walked over, his steps slow, deliberate, like every movement was taking a bit of his strength with it. He knelt down in front of the boy. "Are you okay?" The boy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just nodded, his face pale but the worst of the fear receding. Slowly, Marcus reached out, offering a reassuring hand. "It's over. You're safe now." But Marcus's gut told him otherwise. Something wasn't right. Not yet. As Marcus looked up, he could swear he saw something or someone moving at the edge of the park, a shadow that didn't belong. The air felt thick, heavy with the aftermath of what had just happened. The adrenaline still pulsed through Marcus's veins, making his heart race and his mind spin. He hadn't even stopped to think about what he'd just done. He had acted purely on instinct, a reflex born of years of being aware of danger in ways that most people would never understand. As the man disappeared into the trees, Marcus stood frozen for a moment longer, his eyes darting around, scanning for any sign of movement, anything that felt off. But the park had returned to its ordinary rhythm. The laughter of children playing on distant swings, the sound of a dog barking nearby, the rustling of the trees in the light breeze. Except it wasn't the same. Not for him. Not after what had just happened. The boy, still wide-eyed with fear, hadn't said a word. His body trembled in silence, his tiny hands gripping Marcus's arm with a desperation that spoke volumes. And Marcus, for all his experience, had no words to offer in return. He didn't know how to reassure the boy, not after something like that. His instincts had been to protect, to act. But now, in the quiet aftermath, there was a weight he hadn't expected. The weight of what he'd just seen, of what he'd prevented, and of what could have happened if he hadn't been there. "Hey, you're okay now," Marcus finally said, though even he wasn't sure if it was meant for the boy or for himself. The boy's wide eyes met his, still filled with confusion and fear. But something in Marcus's voice must have reached him, because the boy slowly nodded, his chest heaving with every shallow breath he took. He didn't speak, but his body seemed to relax just slightly, as if he were finally starting to understand that the danger had passed. They walked to Marcus's apartment, and Marcus did his best to keep the boy calm, though it wasn't easy. Every few steps, the boy would look over his shoulder as if expecting the man in the hoodie to appear again. Each glance sent a tightness into Marcus's chest, a creeping feeling that told him this wasn't over. It wasn't just the man he had confronted. It was something bigger, something darker. But for now, the boy needed to feel safe, and Marcus couldn't afford to let his suspicions overshadow that. When they reached Marcus's apartment, the boy hesitated at the door, not sure what to do next. "Do you want to come inside? You can sit down, have some water," Marcus said gently, holding the door open. He was trying to be kind, trying to offer a semblance of comfort, but he knew it wasn't enough. Nothing would erase what had just happened. Not for the boy, not for him. The boy nodded and stepped inside, but his movements were stiff, uncertain. Marcus could see that his mind was still racing, processing everything, trying to make sense of the danger he had just barely escaped. Inside, the small apartment felt colder than it usually did, the silence pressing in on him like a heavy weight. Marcus motioned to the couch, and the boy took a seat, his hand still trembling in his lap. Marcus didn't know what to say. His usual methods of calming people didn't apply here. This wasn't a situation where a quick word could make everything better. He knew that. All he could do was wait, be present, and let the boy know he wasn't alone. Marcus walked into the small kitchen and filled a glass with water. He glanced back at the boy, who was now staring at the floor, lost in thought. The boy's quiet sobs had stopped for the moment, but Marcus could see the toll the fear had taken on him. He placed the glass of water on the table and sat down opposite the boy. "You're safe now," Marcus repeated, more to himself than to the child. His voice felt hollow in the stillness. It was a promise he wanted to believe, but one he couldn't fully grasp yet. He had stopped the kidnapping attempt, sure, but the shadows lurking in the park, the dark figure that had vanished into the trees, it left something behind, something Marcus couldn't shake. The boy glanced up at Marcus, his eyes filled with confusion and unease. Why did he want to take me?" The question was soft, hesitant. It was the one Marcus had been dreading, the one he wasn't prepared to answer. Marcus exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he said honestly. He wanted to tell the boy that it was over, that there was nothing to worry about anymore, but deep down, Marcus knew that wasn't true. He could still feel the presence of danger lingering, like a shadow in the corner of his mind. "But you don't have to worry about that anymore," he added, trying to give the boy some reassurance, even though he didn't feel it himself. "You're safe now. That's all that matters." The boy nodded, but the doubt in his eyes remained. Marcus could see that he wasn't entirely convinced. He couldn't blame him. How could anyone feel safe after something like that? As Marcus looked at the boy, he felt a pang of guilt, though he knew he shouldn't. He had done everything he could in that moment. He'd stopped the man, protected the boy, made sure he was safe. But the guilt was still there, gnawing at him. Could he have done more? Could he have noticed the signs earlier? What if he hadn't been there? It wasn't the first time Marcus had questioned himself in the face of danger. But tonight, it felt different. This was personal. Something about the way the man had acted, the urgency in his movements, had sent a chill down Marcus's spine. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It felt like part of something bigger, something that had been set into motion long before Marcus had intervened. The boy reached for the glass of water, taking a sip before setting it back down. His eyes were still wide, still filled with the haunted remnants of what he'd just survived. "I'm sorry," the boy whispered. "I was just trying to play." Marcus frowned, shaking his head. "No, don't apologize. This wasn't your fault. You did nothing wrong." But the guilt in the boy's voice made something in Marcus twist. He couldn't fathom the weight of what the kid was feeling, but he knew that weight would be hard to shake off. And that made Marcus more determined than ever to get to the bottom of what had really happened here. For the boy, for his own peace of mind. The world outside the apartment was still and quiet, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it was just the calm before the storm. The apartment was quiet now, the kind of quiet that pressed on your eardrums, a heavy silence that made every small sound feel amplified. The boy, exhausted by the shock of what had happened, was finally asleep on the couch, his face pale and peaceful despite everything. The weight of the day had caught up with him, and in that moment, Marcus envied his ability to fall into an uneasy rest. But Marcus couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop thinking. He couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over, that something dark had just been set into motion. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only the dim glow of street lights filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. Marcus moved restlessly through the space, his mind refusing to settle. His hands fidgeted with his phone as he walked from the living room to the kitchen and back again, trying to convince himself that everything would be fine. That everything was fine. But he knew better than that. The knock on the door had come moments after he'd put the boy inside. The strange man with the sharp suit had handed him the cryptic note. "This isn't over." That was all it took. Marcus's pulse had spiked in that moment, the heavy weight of foreboding settling deep in his chest. He had no idea who the man was or why he was following him, but he knew enough to understand that his involvement had crossed a line. He wasn't just a good Samaritan anymore. He was a target. And now his phone was ringing. The shrill sound of the ringtone echoed in the apartment, slicing through the stillness. Marcus froze, a flash of tension shooting through his spine. It was late. Too late. Only a few people had his number. None of them would be calling at this hour. He hesitated for a moment, weighing whether or not to pick up. The uneasy feeling in his stomach twisted tighter, but curiosity pushed him forward. He grabbed the phone, his fingers almost trembling as he accepted the call. "Hello?" Marcus said, his voice low, cautious. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then a voice, cold and calculating, spoke. "We need to talk." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an invitation. It was a demand. And Marcus immediately recognized it for what it was, a warning. He clenched his jaw, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. His heart rate quickened. "Who is this?" The voice on the other end didn't answer his question. Instead, it went straight to the point. "You interfered today. You think you're done with it, but you're not. You don't even understand what you've done." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean? What I've done?" His voice was sharp now, angry. This wasn't just some random threat. This was someone who knew more about the situation than they were letting on. Someone who had been watching. "What's going on?" There was a brief silence, just long enough to make Marcus feel like the ground had shifted beneath him. "You saved the boy," the voice said finally, its tone almost amused. "But that's not going to protect you from what's coming next. And it sure as hell won't protect him." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He could feel his pulse thudding in his ears, the hairs on his arms standing on end. He glanced toward the boy, still asleep on the couch, unaware of the danger that had already come knocking at their door. "What the hell are you talking about?" Marcus demanded. His heart was pounding now, his pulse racing with a fear he couldn't shake. He had known the man in the park was just the tip of the iceberg, but this was something else. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The voice didn't answer that question. Instead, it changed the subject almost casually. "We'll be in touch," the voice said, the finality in its tone unmistakable. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." And then, without another word, the line went dead. Marcus stood there for a long moment, the phone still pressed to his ear, his fingers gripping it so tightly his knuckles were white. He didn't know if the silence that followed the call was worse than the call itself, but it felt like the world had stopped spinning. For the first time since this had all started, Marcus felt truly alone, like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, unable to see the bottom. The safety he had fought to give the boy, hell, the safety he had fought for himself, was slipping through his fingers like sand. His mind raced with possibilities, with questions that had no answers. Who had called? What did they mean? It's not over. What was coming next? And most importantly, what had he gotten himself into? The boy stirred on the couch, a low murmur escaping his lips. Marcus turned his gaze toward him. The boy's face was twisted in a frown, his brows furrowed as if he were dreaming something bad, something worse than what had already happened. Marcus could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He hadn't signed up for this. He had just been a guy in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the moment he had stepped in to protect that child, everything had changed. Marcus ran a hand through his hair and walked to the window, peering out at the street below. The city was quiet, its familiar noises drifting up from the streets, but it was all too quiet. There was something off about the way the shadows moved, something lurking just beyond his field of vision. He had to get to the bottom of this. He had to know what was really going on, not just for the boy's sake, but for his own. Because one thing was clear. Whoever had just called him, whoever had been watching him, wasn't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Marcus turned back to the boy on the couch. The child was still asleep, still oblivious to the storm that was coming. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying part of all. The call had rattled Marcus more than he cared to admit. His mind kept replaying the chilling words, the calm, detached voice that had warned him of something bigger, something he couldn't yet understand. As the phone call ended, he had tried to convince himself that it was just some sick prank, a twisted game. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. This wasn't a coincidence. He wasn't just some random guy who had stumbled into a dangerous situation. No, something more sinister was at play. And it was coming for him, coming for the boy, and there was nowhere to hide. The tension in the apartment hung thick, the kind of silence that presses on you, a weight on your chest. Marcus couldn't sit still. He kept pacing back and forth, his mind racing. He had to do something, but what? Who could he trust? The police? They'd need more than just a man in a hoodie and a vague threat over the phone. Who else could help? His thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a soft, distant rumble that reached him from outside. It was subtle at first, like a low hum in the background, but as it grew louder, Marcus felt his heart rate spike. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He moved toward the window, cautiously drawing the blinds just enough to peer through. The street below was eerily quiet, as it had been since the sun had set. Most of the neighborhood was asleep, unaware of the tension that had settled into Marcus's chest. Then he saw it. A sleek, black SUV parked across the street. Its windows were tinted dark, the vehicle blending into the night as though it were just another part of the urban landscape. But Marcus's gut told him something wasn't right. The way it was positioned, slightly off-center, but just enough to suggest it had been placed deliberately. The vehicle hadn't been there when he had last checked, and now it sat like an ominous sentinel in the night, waiting. Marcus's eyes narrowed. His instinct screamed that this wasn't just a coincidence. He took a step back, his mind racing. Could it be connected to the phone call? Could this be the same people? He knew the man from the park was just the beginning. This was bigger than that. He hesitated for a moment, considering his options. If it was connected to the call, there was no way he was just going to sit around and wait for something worse to happen. But if he went outside, if he made any move, would he be walking straight into danger? The SUV sat there, unmoving, as though it had been waiting for him to notice. The quiet hum of the engine seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of his apartment. It felt like the calm before the storm. Marcus's mind worked quickly, calculating every angle. He wasn't just going to leave the boy vulnerable, not now, not after what he'd been through. But if these people were dangerous, if they were really after him or the boy, he needed to know more. He needed answers, and sitting inside wasn't going to give him those. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and pulled it on, moving with purpose. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew one thing. The moment he stepped outside, things would change. The weight of it settled on his shoulders, making his movements feel heavy and deliberate. He walked quietly toward the door, pausing just before he opened it. For a moment, he stood still, listening. The sounds of the city outside, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional murmur of a passerby, had never felt so distant, so inconsequential. He stepped out onto the landing, closing the door softly behind him. As he made his way down the stairs and out onto the street, the black SUV remained still, almost unnervingly so. Its dark windows reflected the faint glow of the street lights, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was inside, watching him. Marcus's steps were deliberate as he crossed the street. His eyes never left the SUV. He could feel his heart beat in his throat, the adrenaline already beginning to pump through his veins. He reached the sidewalk just in front of the vehicle, his eyes scanning the area around him. There was no one else in sight, no movement from the SUV. He paused just a few feet from the front bumper, and the seconds stretched on, an eternity in the space between breaths. The vehicle was silent, the engine off now, but the sense of unease hung thick in the air like a palpable fog that refused to lift. Then, out of nowhere, the sound of a door opening broke the tension, the subtle click of the door handle, the creak of the heavy metal. Something about it sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. His heart skipped a beat. The door to the SUV was opening. Slowly, Marcus's instincts screamed at him to turn and run, but he stood frozen, his muscles locked, his eyes fixed on the shadowy figure that emerged from the vehicle. He couldn't make out their face, just the silhouette of a tall, broad figure moving in the dark. "Marcus," the figure said, their voice low, almost soothing, like they knew him, like they expected him. Marcus's blood ran cold. The voice was unfamiliar, but the tone, there was something about it that made his skin crawl. His breath hitched in his chest as he searched the figure's form, trying to make sense of what was happening. His mind was racing, trying to piece things together, but it was like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. The figure took another step toward him, their footsteps slow but sure. Marcus felt his legs tense, every part of him ready to spring into action if need be. He knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew he couldn't afford to back down now, not after everything that had already happened. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but his heart pounding in his chest. The figure stopped just a few feet away, their face still obscured by the night. "I'm here because you've made things complicated," they said softly, their voice like gravel. The words hung in the air, each one heavier than the last. The air between them felt thick, almost suffocating. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his throat, his muscles coiled tight, ready for anything. He didn't know who this person was or what they wanted, but he knew they weren't here to chat. They were here to deliver a message, and everything about this encounter screamed danger. The figure took another step forward, the click of their boots on the pavement echoing in the silence of the street. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and every movement was calculated. Even in the dim light, Marcus could feel the weight of their presence, like a predator circling its prey. "Marcus," the figure said again, their voice low, almost measured, as though they were talking to someone they already knew. "We've been watching you." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Who was this person? How did they know his name? He didn't recognize their voice, but that didn't mean much. The city was full of people who could easily be hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting. He had never liked the feeling of being watched, but tonight it felt like the walls were closing in. "I don't know who you are, but I don't have time for games," Marcus said, his voice steady but edged with tension. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, they just stood there, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corner of their lips, though it was impossible to make out any more detail in the darkness. The silence dragged on for several seconds, long enough for Marcus's mind to start to spin again. "You don't realize what you've done, do you?" the figure said at last, their tone almost pitying. "You thought you were helping, thought you were saving a kid from some random threat." They stepped closer, and Marcus instinctively took a half step back, his hand hovering near his side, ready to react. "But the truth is, you've just placed a target on your back, and the boys. You've caught the attention of people who don't take kindly to interference." Marcus frowned, his jaw tightening. "I don't care who you are or who you think you represent. That kid was in danger. I'm not sorry I stepped in." His voice was firm now, his resolve hardening, but inside he was starting to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. It wasn't just a random encounter. This was something much bigger than he had realized, and whatever he had gotten involved in, it wasn't going away anytime soon. The figure's expression, though mostly hidden, seemed to harden in response. They weren't amused, and that only made Marcus more certain that they weren't playing games. This was real, and whatever danger they were threatening was closer than he thought. "Don't mistake your little act of heroism for courage," the figure continued, their voice turning colder, sharper. "You're in way over your head. The people we work for, they don't just forget when someone steps in like this. You've interfered with something far bigger than you could ever understand." The words cut through the night air like a blade. Marcus's mind raced to piece it all together, but it was like trying to hold on to smoke. Who were these people? And what did they mean by something bigger? The warning was clear, but its meaning was still clouded in mystery. "Who are you?" Marcus asked again, this time his voice laced with a sense of desperation. He needed something solid, something to hold on to. "Why are you threatening me? What do you want from me?" The figure took another step forward, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might actually take them down. But before he could make a move, the figure held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. There was a calmness to the gesture that only made the situation feel more ominous. "We don't want anything from you. Not yet," the figure said, their voice chillingly calm. "But we will. Soon enough you'll understand. And when you do, it'll be too late. You're already in this, Marcus. There's no way out." Marcus's stomach twisted. He wanted to push further, demand more answers, but the words felt stuck in his throat. It was like this person knew everything about him, his thoughts, his past, his fears, and they were playing him like a puppet. The figure took a step back, finally breaking the unsettling silence. "This is your warning, Marcus. Do not involve the police. Do not try to run. We'll be watching." The threat lingered in the air like smoke, suffocating the space between them. And, just like that, the figure turned, retreating back toward the black SUV. Marcus stood frozen, his mind still processing what had just happened, still trying to make sense of the words that had been spoken. The SUV's engine roared to life, its headlights blinding for a brief second before they flicked off. The figure got into the vehicle, and before Marcus could react, the SUV sped off into the night, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Marcus stood there for a long moment, the cool night air biting at his skin, trying to ground himself. His pulse was racing, his mind spinning with 1,000 unanswered questions. He had just received a warning, one he couldn't ignore, one he couldn't shake. The boy, he couldn't let anything happen to him. He had made a promise to protect him, to make sure he was safe. But this warning, this ominous threat, made that promise feel fragile, as if everything Marcus had just done had set a chain of events in motion that he couldn't stop. He turned back toward his apartment, every step feeling heavier than the last. The boy was still inside, still asleep, still unaware of what had just happened, but Marcus knew, deep in his gut, that the calm was over. The storm was coming. And now, there was no turning back. The night had been long, filled with too many unanswered questions and the unsettling echo of that warning. Marcus barely slept, his mind churning over everything that had happened. The call, the figure in the dark, the chilling words. He couldn't shake the feeling that every moment that passed was bringing him closer to something dangerous. The boy was still asleep, thankfully unaware of the storm swirling around them both. But Marcus couldn't afford to rest. Not now. He kept thinking back to the SUV, the figure who had given him the warning, and the way they had disappeared into the night. It all felt like a bad dream, a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. He tried to convince himself that maybe he had overreacted, that maybe he was just paranoid. But something deep inside told him that this wasn't over. No, it was just beginning. And sure enough, as the first light of morning crept through the blinds, that gut feeling proved to be right. The sound of an engine roared in the distance, faint at first, but unmistakable. Marcus's eyes snapped to the window, his heartbeat quickening. He couldn't see the vehicle yet, but he knew. He knew it was them. The black SUV. It was back. His pulse thudded in his ears as he turned away from the window and moved quickly to the door, trying to stay as quiet as possible. He hadn't told anyone about the warning. He couldn't. Who would believe him? The police would think he was crazy. And besides, they hadn't even really done anything wrong. Not yet. But Marcus could feel the noose tightening, the sense of danger closing in on him. He stepped back to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peered through the blinds. The SUV was there, creeping slowly down the street, its black paint gleaming in the early morning light. This time, the vehicle didn't stop. It kept moving, slowly, methodically, as though it were searching for something or someone. Marcus's breath caught in his chest. His instinct screamed at him to do something, anything, but he couldn't just bolt out the door. Not yet. Not until he knew what was going on. The SUV passed by, its windows still tinted dark, its presence as menacing as ever. He could feel the weight of the vehicle, like it was a shadow following him, stalking him. And then, as if to confirm his worst fears, the SUV slowed down and stopped right in front of his building. His stomach dropped. The vehicle came to a smooth halt, the engine quieting, but its presence still felt like an undeniable force. Marcus's pulse spiked. The only thing louder than his racing heart was the silence that followed. It was the kind of silence that made everything feel wrong. Too quiet, too still. Marcus backed away from the window, his mind racing. Should he run? Should he try to get the boy to safety? The kid was still asleep, still blissfully unaware of the danger that had followed them home. But Marcus knew that wasn't an option. He couldn't just leave him behind. Before he could make a decision, a familiar sound broke the quiet, the unmistakable sound of the SUV's door opening. The figure from last night stepped out of the vehicle. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. There they were again, tall, imposing, the same shadowy figure from before. They didn't move immediately, just stood by the car for a moment, as if waiting for something. Their posture was relaxed, but every part of them screamed purpose. This was no casual visit. They were here for a reason, and Marcus knew it wasn't good. The figure looked up at the building, their gaze sweeping slowly over the windows. Marcus felt a chill race down his spine. It was like they were looking directly at him, looking into him, as if they knew exactly where he was, what he was thinking. For a split second, Marcus considered confronting them, demanding answers, but the figure's gaze hardened, like they could feel the pull of his presence. Marcus held his breath, hoping they wouldn't notice him, but deep down, he knew that wasn't going to happen. They'd already been watching him, and now they were here. He was caught. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward the building, then stopped. Another moment of silence. Then a voice, just loud enough for Marcus to hear through the closed window. "We don't have time for games, Marcus. Come out now." The words hit Marcus like a jolt of electricity. His mind raced, his hands trembling at his sides. They knew he was here. They knew everything. He glanced back at the boy, still asleep on the couch, and the fear surged through him again. If they got to the boy, if they hurt him, it would all be on Marcus. He couldn't let that happen. The figure's gaze was still locked on the building, as if they were patiently waiting for him to make his move. Marcus swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for a way out, but the path was growing narrower by the second. He didn't have the luxury of hesitation. With a shaky breath, Marcus stepped back from the window, gathering every ounce of courage he had left. He knew what had to be done, but he couldn't do it alone. Not now. He needed help, and he needed it fast. Marcus's breath was shallow, each inhale and exhale a struggle against the weight of the situation. The figure outside was still, but every fiber of his being screamed that the threat wasn't over. Far from it. The words they'd spoken, the cold certainty in their voice, hung in the air like an inescapable doom. He couldn't run. He couldn't hide. They had already found him, already made it clear that they were in control. The boy, Marcus glanced over his shoulder, his heart thumping in his chest, was still asleep on the couch, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around them. Marcus had promised himself he'd protect him, but with the figure outside, that promise felt like a fragile thread, ready to snap at any moment. The figure took a step toward the entrance, and Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Every instinct in him screamed to act, to do something. But what? What could he do against someone so powerful, so calculating? He couldn't face them alone. He needed help. But who could he trust? The sound of another door opening snapped Marcus out of his thoughts. The figure from the SUV wasn't alone anymore. A second person, dressed in dark clothing, emerged from the back of the vehicle. They moved with purpose, their face hidden in the shadow of a hood. Marcus's mind raced. 2 of them now. This was no longer a random threat. It was organized, planned. The first figure, still standing near the SUV, glanced toward the building. The second figure, taller, leaner, moved forward with purpose, making their way toward the apartment complex. Marcus's throat went dry. They were coming for him, for the boy. He had no more time to think. Without warning, Marcus backed away from the window, eyes darting across the apartment. There was no escape. The back door? The alley? His mind was a blur of possibilities, but there was only one thought that stood out. Protect the boy, no matter what. His hand reached for the door, ready to leave the apartment, to face whatever was coming. But just as his fingers brushed the handle, he heard a voice. One that was calm, measured, but carrying the weight of absolute finality. "Marcus, it's over. We've waited long enough. Come outside." The voice was unmistakable. It was the figure from the SUV. They knew he was in there. They weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. Marcus froze, his hand still on the door. The seconds felt like hours. Every part of him screamed to run, to break free. But he couldn't just leave. The boy needed him. He couldn't let these people get their hands on him. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, louder, closer. Someone was coming, and Marcus knew there was no more time. The door to his apartment creaked open, and just when it seemed like all was lost, the door swung open, and Marcus stepped out into the unknown. The moment of decision had arrived, and there was no turning back. What would you do if you were in Marcus's shoes? Would you face the danger head on, or would you try to run? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to find out what happens next, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what's coming up next.